All right. Well, good evening, Mariah. I'm here with Dr. Mariah Starr, and my name is John Clark, and we're here to with our second video to discuss the illegitimacy of the U.S. government at this point. And I was wondering, before your opening remarks, Mariah, if you might give a little introduction to yourself again, and I'll do the same for myself, and then we'll just get started.
Yes. So my name is Marriah Starr. I graduated from Harvard University from college 26 years ago, 1998, class 98, 99. Then I went to graduate school at the City University of New York, got my PhD in political science, and I taught college classes, graduate school classes, and high school classes in New York City, Boston, Beijing, China, Shenzhen, China, and Tucson, Arizona, my hometown. And I've taught American government, American history, international relations, world history, sociology over the past 21 years. So I'll stop there.
That's very helpful for me. And as on a personal note, that's been very helpful because, as we've discussed, I've been completely caught off guard by how fast things have developed since Trump took office, and just to give a little bit of my background. I have an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering and graduate training in clinical psychology and cognitive neuroscience, which is a relatively new field. And my specialty within the cognitive neuroscience is consciousness or first person representation. So the idea is that we we got into this spot as a country um, uh, through a process, and that now we're at what I might consider a crossroads, where we have to understand how we got here and what our obligations are in the context of what is in effect broadly considered a failure of democracy and uh, and um, and a step towards an authoritarian regime and a fascist government. And so I was uh, I was hoping you could explain a little bit about fascism, authoritarianism, and how a society can fall into what those of us that let's say appreciate democracy or certain freedoms that we have that consider it highly detrimental to the nation's future and the health of the population.
Yeah. So the best way to approach authoritarianism and fascism is to stop thinking of them initially as political orientations. The politics is the result, but the cause is a mindset. And as a mindset, the authoritarian mindset acts as a proxy, a way of expressing itself in parenting. So this was discovered about 10 years ago when Trump first came on the scene. An authoritarian is someone who believes in a natural hierarchy, a natural um, mode of existence that requires people at the bottom to respect people at the top. So the top and the bottom is different in every single environment, but in parenting, it's the parents who are at the top, the children at the bottom. An authoritarian parent wants the children to treat the parent with complete respect and to obey everything the parent said the child should do. No questions asked. Discipline is the essence of a good child from that perspective. In contrast, the opposite perspective says children are the equals of parents. They are young and developing minds, and they should be treated with respect. And so it's the parent who ends up serving the needs of the child and negotiating with the child boundaries.
And that in psychology is referred to as authoritative parenting, which is produces healthy attachments, healthy relationships, and healthy adults. In some of my coursework at the undergraduate level in psychology, uh, I we were discussing this, and one of my classmates is the daughter of a policeman. She had a lot to say about what authoritarian parenting looks like and feels like. And so she didn't have very many positive things to say.
Yeah. So parenting is just one way the authoritarian mindset expresses itself. But if you go anywhere else, you'll find it. In the arts, you'll find it. The authoritarian is the person who says there's good art and bad art. There are good movies and bad movies. There are good paintings and bad paintings. And as an authoritarian, you see the bad paintings as a threat to culture. And as a result, you want to prevent or eliminate those bad cultural artifacts from being made in the first place.
So would it be something that would be considered, let's say, the bad paintings taken away from the quality of the good paintings just by their very existence?
It's
Or
not about the quality of the good paintings, it's about the health and sanctity of the community. The good paintings improve the community. The bad paintings destroy the community.
okay, so it isn't that they have an effect on one another, it's the effect on the community that this good and bad dichotomy produces.
Exactly. So the work of Jonathan Haidt at NYU, I think um, he's done a lot of research on the role of disgust in culture. Authoritarians are conservative, and conservatives have a high sensitivity toward disgust. So whether it's food or architecture or painting or novels, those can cause disgust, meaning they're a threat to the body and the human condition in the community.
And it's that particular emotion is processed in the body, it's felt in the body, it isn't intellectually characterized.
Yes, it's pre-intellectual. It's a felt sensory experience. Like when I experience disgust towards something, I'm not even thinking. I'm simply responding to my body's reaction to what's in
Right.
front of me. Now,
So if I have your attention on that level and I can find things that disgust you, then I have some level of control over the things I can present to you that would not be disgusting.
yes. So the job of the authoritarian or the fascist is to present the other as a threat to your community so that you then give the authoritarian agency control over the other.
Right, right.
Now,
And go
here's the
ahead.
thing. The authoritarian mindset is very much based in uh, a rural lifestyle that is very fragile and where disgust plays a very important role. because if you don't have disgust, then you can't prevent disease from coming into your farm. You can't prevent insects from coming to your food. So you have to have disgust because that is the role of survival. But if you have
And the particular environments that we're talking about are fragile because growing food depends on things that can't be controlled. There are outside influences that can't be controlled. So I imagine that, let's say, the farmer would actually control those things they can control,
yeah,
because they have to open up to the possibility they could lose everything based on an event that is beyond their control. So they want stability and continuity from administration to administration that aren't going to affect their ability to farm and both make a living and feed themselves and others.
yeah, you're right. So the liberal mindset comes from urban environments because urban environments force you to deal with the other on a daily basis, whether it's immigrants who are coming into the city or new fashion trends, new movies, new food choices made by the immigrants. Urban spaces confront you with new things all the time. So you
So there's
have
a
to
lot of
have a
novelty.
yes, it's filled with novelty. So you have to have a very low sensitivity toward disgust. You have to suppress it even.
Right.
So what we see in terms of liberalism versus conservatism is that there really are the urban environments versus the rural environments. And so the rural environments are trying to protect themselves from encroachment by the urban environments and vice versa.
Interesting. And so both like environments expect that the other should understand where they're coming from and adopt that particular strategy in life because in the liberals' perspective, it's most inclusive and best for everybody, and in the conservatives' perspective, allowing everything and anything and everything is a disaster because there are so many elements that are uncontrollable. It just increases the risk to survival.
Yes. So most people make an accommodation. And we use the metaphor, the city mouse versus the country mouse, to describe the accommodation that we make in terms of live and let live. But authoritarians don't do that. They have a rigid hierarchy that says the rural life is inherently superior to the urban life, and they then universalize their values and force everyone to adopt them.
So, is it the right time to bring in where education falls into this mix? Because the individual living in an urban area is likely to have a higher education than an individual living in a farming community.
Correct, but that's by design because the individual living in the farming community views education as a threat.
New ideas, novelty,
No, pride.
pride. Interesting.
So there's this documentary called The Devil's Playground that talks about the Amish. And the Amish are well known for living intentionally as if they're in the 18th century. They never modernize. Well, that's because the Amish have a theology that says you can't accept the Lord Jesus Christ as your Savior until you've turned 16 and gone into the devil's playground, which is the modern world, and
Right.
been tempted by the devil. And then you make the choice to come back to the the community of Jesus Christ as a humble servant. So any education beyond 16 makes you prideful by definition.
Interesting. And so that would separate you from God, so to speak.
Yes.
And then, as we had discussed earlier, uh, as far as Christianity is concerned, that forbidden knowledge or that unnecessary knowledge is might be considered from Garden of Eden. That from the beginning of Genesis, they're counseling not to know any more than you need to know. That if you want to know things just for knowledge's sake, that's unhealthy.
Yes. So this translates into politics because we know from both the 2020 from the 2016 election, 2020, and 2024 that the college educated are most likely to support Democratic candidates. The non the people who never went beyond 12th grade of high school are most likely to support Republican candidates. So what we're trying to do now is communicate to those people who have both a college degree and don't have a college degree how to respond to what's happening right now.
Right, because ultimately a fascist environment serves almost nobody except the power structure, to my knowledge.
Yes. So what we're trying to deal with is a very simple problem. The the government that is authoritarian or fascist does things that are evil. It hurts the innocent. It violates the law. It ignores due process. I mean, we have countless examples every single day of the government doing bad things.
And that's literally at times this year, obviously this year in particular, but I've found it paralyzing, and in many times I wanted to just turn away and say I can't listen to this person talk anymore because of what I'm hearing them say. But in discussion with you, that's the wrong approach.
Yeah,
You're supporting the evil of a regime like that when you don't participate and you look the other way because maybe your situation isn't so terrible. And so some are like, maybe I'll get passed over.
so it is healthy to express moral outrage at things that are bad that are happening because of a government action. However, it's, the first instinct when expressing moral outrage is to stop there with the outrage and to avoid action because you want to hunker down, you want to protect yourself and your loved ones, and you don't want to become a target of government action.
Right.
So
And it's a pretty popular notion. If you're the first one to speak up, you're the first one to get shot, so to speak,
exactly.
metaphorically.
So what we're trying to do is talk to those people who are expressing the moral outrage, but are also trying to avoid getting caught up in any protest action because they don't want to become targets. We're trying to tell them we need to become active even if we become targets.
Yeah, and that's a hard that's a hard pill to swallow. You know, I'm thinking about re-entering technology, and I know there's some things that we could discuss that would give an employer pause. You know, do companies want activist workforce? No, they don't. They
Yeah,
want people to come in, put their head down, get their job done, and it's quite common to comb people's social media accounts to look for anything that would be detrimental to corporate interests. Um,
exactly. So that's why we need to draw on history to learn the lessons of previous activists and how they sustained their activism over time, especially during the most recent period of activism um, the civil rights movement that took place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's still hard to wrap myself around the depth of courage to to have real crimes inflicted upon you when there was no recourse but to make your point but to suffer through it, or like you had mentioned, traveling on a bus knowing that you're going to be physically attacked when you reach your destination. That's a tough pill to swallow. Those people had a lot of courage, but they also had community, and they had alternatives to the things that the government would want to take away to punish. Um, I think there's a good example that we've discussed with Rosa Parks, who refused to change seats in a bus. She wasn't the first person complaining about it, but she was the one that the community got behind, and they boycotted the bus, which meant that they had to have alternatives, and so that was very powerful. So um, we also need, I think, to think in those terms of what can we do community wise to support each other, whether it's protest actions, whether it's contacting congresspersons. They really do live in a bubble back there, um, and making our voices heard. It
Yeah,
and it's the government would ideally like to have to suppress violence, but in the protests so far this year, there really hasn't been any. And why? I think that a lot of it has to do with the privileged class being out there, middle-aged white people, people worried about their Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, and they don't automatically invite aggression from law enforcement, and probably much to the success of the current movement to draw attention to what's going on is the fact that a lot of people of color chose to sit this out because they didn't want to be targets, and they would be the scapegoats and the targets in suppressing this revolution that's unfolding. So whether I'm right
yes,
about that or not, I don't know. I
you
would
probably
defer
are
to your
right.
background.
So we need to talk about community, especially what we call civil society. It consists of elements, spaces that are conducive to organization. So the first part of civil society that we experience automatically is the household and the neighborhood.
Right.
So knowing your neighbors, sharing resources with your neighbors is rule number one of being in civil society. Then, once you get beyond your neighbors, you get to the three or four kinds of institutions or parts of society that are sort of designed for engagement. That includes the school, the church, the small business, the arts organization, like a movie theater or a playhouse, and the security apparatus, like firefighters, police officers. Finally, you have the local politicians, including the mayor and city council people, and neighborhood watch groups.
My initial thought is, hey, it'd be great to like get more involved with city council politics and that. However, they're going to be pretty locally focused, and what we're talking about is raising awareness and developing resilience for something that is organized nationally.
Yes. So the favorite phrase for political scientists is all politics are local. So for the national government to achieve its aims, it needs to co-opt, take over the local forces.
Would that be starting with state level politicians and not worrying so much about counties?
No, it starts with counties.
Oh,
So you start
okay.
with the counties first, then you go. So ideally, you go to the state level politicians and they put pressure on the counties, but that depends on the local politics of the state, how it works. So in some states, the state government is more important than the local government. In other states, the local government is more important than the state government.
Uh-huh.
But that's the thing you have to do as a citizen. You have to figure out where the action actually is,
So,
where the money is.
so the power here is that you don't have to muster all the energy and resilience on your own when you find a community that fits for you.
Yes. So once you have developed the ability to communicate with your housemates or your neighbors, then you go to the church and the head of a Jewish synagogue or the head of the pastor of a Christian church or an imam in a mosque, they have the ethical responsibility to respond to members of their community. So they will be
Right.
the first lines of resistance toward government inaction.
So if you have a like a spiritual direction, then that your church may be one of the early places you can go for support.
Yes. So the church is the most common place, and the church happens to be the central organizing apparatus for the success of the civil rights movement.
Right, right. And that was huge. And I
Yes.
think you were also telling me that Martin Luther King was attractive in those protests because he wasn't part of the political leadership, the black political leadership that existed that was trying to create reform. So he couldn't just be identified readily and pulled into custody to interrupt his activities.
Yes. So the civil rights movement was successful in the 60s because the black leadership in every city knew that they were on the police radar and that their activities could be stopped just by harassment by the police before they did the marches. So it
Right.
was King who was under the radar. The police didn't know him. And his newness on the scene made him a powerful figure in Montgomery, Alabama, when the Montgomery bus boycott was happening.
Right, which is yeah, that's some of the most uh, amazing times in the civil rights movement. It was when King first came on the scene and was working with the protests and
Yes.
helping support the marches.
So,
And they were attacked by dogs. I mean,
yes.
it's just really quite spectacular events that I was a little too young to appreciate because I was a child of the '60s, like a toddler.
Yeah.
And so I remember watching JFK's funeral on TV. And that was one of my earlier memories of things that were happening outside my household. And so uh, I didn't understand the civil rights movement because I grew up in a white blue collar neighborhood that wasn't necessarily bigoted. It just wasn't on anybody's radar. People were busy like working and doing what they needed to do to survive. But in fact, I mean, survival wasn't bad because you could be a married male with a family, and if you had a head grocery store clerk job, you could afford to buy a house somewhere. So things were quite a bit different then.
Yes, and there were people in the 70s and 80s who were sort of latecomers to the movement, or weren't affected by it at all. But what we can learn from the movement itself is that sustained activism, the stamina, comes from the community itself. It is
Right.
impossible to be a lone activist and sustain your energy.
And sustaining an effort is key. If you look at the news cycles and you look at some of the things that let's say politicians have done, and then they just keep denying, keep gaslighting, and eventually those actions can fade into the background. And that's one of the things that really caught me off guard is some things should be at the forefront of public consciousness until it was dealt with. And yet politicians have figured out that if you engage in subterfuge for long enough, then it'll just go away. And and so that consistency, persistence, and the longevity of an effort is extraordinarily important to effecting a change, especially when us as regular citizens don't have all the power and the resources of the people that we're protesting and fighting against.
Yeah. So you use the term gaslighting. Do you know where that comes from?
I believe it was a movie that took place in the 1940s, but I'd like to hear your explanation because I find it pretty fascinating.
Yeah, the term gaslighting comes from a movie called Gaslight. And the plot of the movie tells us how gaslighting works. So at the beginning of the movie, there's a burglar in a house who is trying to get access to jewelry stored in the attic in the house, or stored in the living room, I guess.
Right.
And the police come before he's able to find the jewels, but he wants those jewels. So 20 years later, he marries the girl who was living in that house so that he can find those jewels at last.
Because he's in the house with her all the time now.
As the husband, yes. And so the jewels have been transferred from the living room to the attic. So he goes up to the attic and turns on the lights, which are gas lights. And that makes the lights at the bottom flicker. Well, the wife notices the flickering and tells her husband, "Hey, they're flickering." And he says, "No, they're not. They're not flickering." And so over the course of years, he continues to search for the jewels, and she still brings up the gas lights that are flickering. And he tells her they're not, and then finally he finds the jewels. But then she finds out he's the guy who was a burglar and has him arrested. So my interpretation of the movie is that what's happened, the reason why it's called gaslight and the reason why it translates into the terminology today of make someone believe they can't believe their own eyes
Right.
is because before she got married, she had friends, girlfriends, and they would talk amongst themselves and verify their shared interpretation of reality. But in those days, after you get married, those friends go away, and your spouse, your husband, becomes the sole arbiter of what is real and what is not real. So you're going from many sources of empiricism to one.
Sounds kind of humorous from today's perspective in terms of relationships. However, there's clearly a lot of truth to that in the patriarchal organization of the 20th century.
Yes. So this man, as her husband, acquires the authority to dictate her reality because he's the only person she sees every day now.
And
Otherwise, she's
during
stuck
that
by her
time,
husband.
it was possible for a husband to have their wife committed based on the husband's
Yes,
statements alone, which is as somebody who's been trained in clinical psychology at the graduate level, it's absolutely shocking that was tolerated.
yes. Okay, so the reason why gaslighting matters is because it sends us retrograde. It so by retrograde I mean um the essence of the modern world is that we do not rely on revealed truth from a priest as a source of our reality. Instead, we go to school, we learn to be empirical, we learn that it's important to read the newspaper, to read magazines, to watch documentaries, to gather evidence for your claims. That's what empiricism is.
Well, one of the things that I like about the whole idea of a separation in church and state and why it is powerful is just give me a moment to gather my thought on that. Um, is because the government takes care of the external structures that the people operate within, the empirically generated um, uh, institutions, the way we interact with them, and so on. It's all like a physical thing. The church actually is their domain is our interior experience, our first person representation, and they shouldn't be setting policy, and they shouldn't be mucking it up with the government, because what it does is it literally, from a psychological perspective, can convince a person to collapse their internal sense into the authoritarian sense that they're being fed, when in fact the churches by design is supposed to awaken somebody up to their own internal sense, and those nonverbal things that can't be put into language or pictures. There's something that we know, but we can't put it into any terms. The church is supposed to help us with coming to terms with our own self and our own path and so on. And it doesn't have to do with government, and all the way back to Cyrus the Great in the Persian Empire in like 550 BCE. Um, he recognized the risk of the clergy having the power of the state, that they should be separate. And throughout history, at least from my knowledge, you're the historian. When the two become conflated with each other, you are facing the collapse of your society. And so that's what I've found from my research, is there really needs to be a separation. The church is like, has dominion over, let's say, the circle of love, and the government is more objectively oriented towards supporting people in the circle of life, engaging with somebody, starting a family, and so on. And so they both have their roles. When they try to fulfill the other's role, I have seen, at least in my studies, that leads to the very poor results.
You're right. And that's why the fascist and totalitarian regimes of the 20th century were destroyed because they essentially were using the powers of the state to replace the church in people's lives.
Right.
And so that's why I bring up gaslighting, because if the modern world is based on the rejection of revealed truth from a church, then what happens in an authoritarian regime or fascist regime is that they are trying to replace the multitude of empirical sources with the singular source of the government. The
Right.
government is the only source of reality for you.
So, what advice do you give somebody like me who really was caught off guard by the pace of change? I didn't understand how authoritarian regimes, how they conduct their business, and a lot of what I have experienced is by design and according to what's referred to as an authoritarian playbook. And so, what does somebody like me do who might be pretty well informed, and yet the pace of things that are happening and the damage and the cruelty can be completely overwhelming, and that takes one into their body and their stress and takes them away from analytic and empirical thought and the resulting good decisions you can make in that environment to chart a path forward.
And well, the first thing you have to do is find a community of people who share your moral outrage.
Right. And ideally that's local and not necessarily. I mean, I think online communities are important, but but um but it's good to go and be in somebody's presence. I think it's good to it's good to go somewhere and meet as a group, not crack your computer open to Facebook and have discussions, arguments, debates, and so on with a whole collection of Facebook friends, maybe few of which you actually know personally.
Well, it's the shared physical space that facilitates the creation of community, making it easier. So, meeting someone's living room, meeting for dinner, meeting for lunch, um, having a movie night together, like those are all techniques of community building.
And weren't those things that I think Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall employed
Yes,
back before he was a Supreme Court justice?
yes. I mean, that's the essence of civic activism right there. You have to go from kitchen table to kitchen table, meeting people where they live. And
Right,
if you aren't doing that, then you have to go from church to church, meeting people where they worship.
right. And again, we're dealing with things that are internally focused, are supportive of emotional well-being and resilience when faced with difficult times, which we're in now and heading to a worse situation.
Yeah. So yeah, I appreciate you asking for like personal advice about how to respond. And what I have to remind you and other people watching is that we have to stop thinking of of our situation in the present tense. We must accept from the starting point that the government, the federal government, lost its legitimacy to exist the day Donald Trump was sworn in for a second term.
And I know it's our view and many other people's view that the government is going to cease to exist in its present form or even previous form because of what Trump is currently doing. Because we have a collapse of the separation of powers between the executive, Congress, um, Congress, and the judiciary. Um, Instead of having an independent top law enforcement officer, we have Pam Bondi, who basically is doing Trump's bidding. And,
Yes. But
and
but but even before all that happened, um, Trump's inauguration on January 20th this year rendered the 14th Amendment, Section C, obsolete.
right. Well, what was interesting is on top of that, the Electoral College was supposed to prevent something like this happening, informed individuals
Yeah.
that would prevent a criminal from taking office, and they didn't do their job either.
And then before that, June of last year, no, July of last year, the Supreme Court said the president is immune from criminal prosecution for all official acts. That makes the president a king.
Right. And before that, the speaker of or the Senate leader Mitch McConnell refused to prosecute Trump when he was impeached the second time over January 6th. Um, Probably thinking you never had to deal with the guy again because you do something like what he did. Who could ever imagine that he'd be in office again? But had he been prosecuted then, he would have been forbidden to run, forbidden to take office, and subject to all the criminal proceedings against him that were in process when he won this last election.
Yes. So to sum up, having lost its legitimacy to exist, we have a moral responsibility as citizens to destroy the government and replace it with something else.
Right. And there are some really, really good ways to engage in that. Obviously, destroy the government. You're not going to put together a militia and take up arms. That's just not happening. Um, but there are numerous different ways of non-participation in the different travesties that are happening that severely affect the government's ability to continue to operate in the way they are. And if the government wasn't sensitive to any of this stuff, we'd already be under martial law. Elections would already be suspended. There would be no 2028 election or 2026 midterms. They would just shut all that stuff down, but they can't. And they, meaning the Project 2025 people that produced the document that Trump seems to be following in earnest. Um,
Yes.
and so yeah. I mean, it's quite a mess that we're in because of the actions that weren't taken more recently to prevent him from taking office again, which delegitimizes the entire U.S. government.
Yeah, so this is why we are trying to get the viewers to develop their stamina for activism
Right.
because the changes that we're talking about are so large, they will take probably a whole generation to complete. So we're at the beginning of what is likely to be a 25-year process.
Well, if you want an eventful life, I guess it's an exciting time to be alive.
Yes.
I may or may not see the fruition of that process. Um, it Yeah, it depends, and there's likely to be a lot of civil unrest between now and then, and in um, countries that want to crack down militarily on their populations. If the population itself doesn't provide enough justification, then the government itself will do something and blame it on the activists and crack down then. Like I fully expect some type of false flag operation, or if that's an appropriate term to use in this circumstance, or some event that the government uses to say enough's enough, or we're taking over. There's no way we can have integrity in midterm elections, and so on and so forth. Um, so they are sensitive. You have to bring a population to maybe what would be considered the brink of destruction before you can completely take over, and that's a process. And if we're aware of that process, we can take a lot of actions that are preventative.
Yes. And those actions should start as nonviolent, but they will naturally transition to violence.
And that's most likely to be prompted by the state.
Yes.
And
And so
so,
so what we have is multiple iterations of engagement. Um, there's protests, but then there's direct action. And direct action requires meeting the state where it is and using violence against the state's violence. So the violence that is used by the citizens will be deemed terrorism, and the violence used by the state will be called legitimate because legally it
and
is.
and it's pretty fascinating how the state literally is the only entity allowed to use violence in the course of their business. Which,
Yeah,
I think it under controlled circumstances, I think it's important that not be like what everybody has access to, or like everybody can. By law it should be that way, but when you have a state that's breaking the law, has no due process, there isn't a single person in this country that's safe from that. When due process breaks down, we already don't really have a democracy anymore. Um,
yes. So the lesson is when the state is following due process and obeying the law, the citizen does not have the right to become vigilante. But when the state is ignoring due process and breaking the law all the time, the citizen must become a vigilante and use violence.
yeah, it's just if you start there, the citizens have the possibility of delegitimizing their own selves,
Exactly. So the citizen must wait until the state instigates it.
right? And the state actually got away with an action very much like that, in my opinion, was with the Wall Street protests, the 99%. I looked into that in some reasonable level of detail, and it was actually an amazing movement. It was like they they actually didn't have a hierarchy on purpose, because it is like how the government they're protesting against is organized, and Wall Street and the financial inequities. And um, so it was like a community based protest, and that information was passed verbally, from front to back of the crowd and things like that. It was really impressive in my view. The way the state dealt with that was to employ provocateurs to start violence so that the police would have an excuse to attack the protesters. And ultimately, they were able to shut down the protests without without it ever becoming public in any major news media what they were about. The mainstream news media vilified these people as unemployed, and they should just go get a job instead of bitching about income inequality, and they were maligned on every level that you can think of. And when that wasn't enough, the provocateurs came in and gave the police an opportunity to attack. And what was fascinating about that to me is when the movement recognized that there were provocateurs, they learned how to identify them and separated themselves from the provocateurs as quickly as possible so that they wouldn't get collected up in police actions. And police didn't care about any of that. You know, they were an apparatus of the state, and their job was to shut it down. And it was very effective, like very effective.
Yeah, so I think we can go more into the history of different protest movements in the next couple videos.
That would be good because that would also give people an idea of what to expect, um, what dangers are inherent in confronting your government, and and um, and I really want to reiterate that under these kinds of circumstances, regardless of what our thoughts are individually, uh, we can't be a passive observer because that actually is an expression of evil when you, let's say, you would allow your neighbor to be taken away without any concern because it's not you.
Yeah, so that's why we need to end on two notes. Um, the first is to remember the quote, I think it's John Stuart Mill, who said, "The only way for evil to succeed is for good men to do nothing."
That was John Stuart Mill that
I
first said
think
that.
so. I could be wrong about that. Offhand. Uh,
Well, you know, famous figures also borrow
yeah,
quotes from other people. I just read through a bunch of quotes by Winston Churchill, and some of them I'd seen other people make afterwards, and I thought, oh, okay, so they didn't originate that quote; it was Churchill.
yeah.
But then maybe
But
he didn't.
but regardless of the author, the quote makes sense.
Yeah, it makes absolute sense.
Evil exists, and for it to succeed, you as a good person must do nothing.
Right. And um, and so making these videos, at least from my perspective, is part of what I can do because I have an understanding of an individual internal experience from a technical perspective, and can get into that when we discuss, you know, a little bit more when we discuss various protest movements and maybe where they succeeded, where they may have failed, how they could have been more effective. We should be learning from what's been done to understand what to do.
Yes. And so
And
that's why the second
so,
note is to remind people that there's sins of commission and sins of omission. So right now we're trying to talk to the people who are in the sin of omission. They're not doing enough to respond to what's happening in our environment. And we're trying to convert them to sins of commission. You need to be active. And even if you do things that are wrong as an activist, it's in the name of justice, serving justice. And
right,
so we want to help people transition from omission to commission.
right. And so I think it's important that we're, you know, advocating like what could be considered a peaceful warrior approach. Um, but as warriors, if attacked, we must respond in some way. It doesn't
Yes.
necessarily mean in kind, but can't it can't remain an action that received no response.
Yes. So anyone viewing this video must become aware enough to respond when required.
So we can talk more a little bit more next time, also with how we got here, and extend the what to do into, well, you know, people did this in civil rights, people did this in the Wall Street, you know, even how the media responds. Um, so so
Yeah.
yeah, I look forward to that. The basic thing is that I would recommend from a personal perspective is to hang in there. Um, we can definitely learn what's going on, fill in those blind spots by consuming appropriate information. When I produce this video, I try to include some links, the ways people can connect. There are local and national organizations that are actively recruiting members for the purposes that we're discussing. And our orientation isn't so much, there is no preservation of what once existed, that we're oriented towards how to prepare for what will exist and survive to that point, and that means becoming involved. There
Yes.
isn't another way around it.
And so becoming involved requires taking the first step. After you've consumed information, share it in a physical space with someone else. It could be at a movie theater, it could be in a park, it could be in a public square, it could be at a library, it could be in someone's living room after watching this video, but it must be a physical space because it's in that physical space you can build the energy through collaboration.
Yeah, I thought about trying to get something going at a university. I've got a couple of connections into. I live in Orange County, California, and so we have Long Beach State here, USC, UCLA, and UC Irvine, UC San Diego, San Diego State. So there's major universities here that I want to connect with some people in. Um, Initially, I was just planning on giving it a talk on what to do with your future to high school students, but I might try to reorient some of my proposed talks. So
Okay,
we'll see. In
good.
any case, I'll say more about the internal experience of this kind of environment, and you can continue to enlighten us on your vast structural knowledge of what's taken place, what's currently taken place, and where we're at. So I
Perfect.
appreciate your time, Mariah.
You're
As
welcome.
always, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay, see you next video. Thank you.
All right, see you next video.